Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about slavery, which is not funny. With slavery, every time you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, it turns out to have been much worse. Slavery was hugely important to America. I mean, it led to a civil war, and it also lasted what, at least in U.S. history, counts as a long-ass time, from 1619 to 1865. And yes, I know there's a 1,200-year-old church in your neighborhood in Denmark, but we're not talking about Denmark. But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially King Cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities, like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all Southern urbanization took place in the Upper South, further away from the large cotton plantation. And as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like, for instance, railroads. This lack of industry and railroads would eventually make the South suck at the Civil War, thankfully. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. But as slavery became more entrenched and as ideas of liberty and political equality were embraced by more people, some Southerners began to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. They argued, for instance, that slaves benefited from slavery. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like, slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human. But it didn't work. Let's go to the thought bubble. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back to Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on the Underground Railroad. But a more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back, and in the end, they won.